Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake is one of only 2 games in the entire Metal Gear Solid franchise that I had yet to have beaten until the making of this video. I had hopped on to the Metal Gear Solid train post Metal Gear Solid 2, played that for the first time, fell in love with it. Immediately from there, I went on to Metal Gear Solid 3, which was released in 2005, I want to say. I would go on to play Metal Gear Solid 3, which would cement my unbridled love for the franchise. Back in the PS2 era of gaming, it was more difficult to play older games. Emulation wasn't as much of a thing as it is now, plus I didn't have a PC at the time, so the only way I could even experience these older games was to buy the console and the cartridge or disc they originally came on off of eBay. This was also in the early days of online shopping, so shipping costs were pretty high at the time, and the standard that Amazon set with their one-day delivery was a thing of dreams. Not to mention Metal Gear 2 never actually came out in the West. Well, sort of. After the runaway success of Metal Gear in the East, Konami saw fit to bring the stealth action title to Western audiences. Almost a year after the initial launch, Metal Gear would be ported to the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, in June 1988. Though Konami developed the NES version, Kojima was not involved in the process at all. Due to budget and time restraints, the NES version would see several alterations from the original work, which would lead to Hideo Kojima himself publicly condemning the port at the time. Despite objectively making the game worse for Western audiences, it was still a success commercially, which prompted Konami and their North American publisher Ultra Games to release a sequel exclusive to the Western market titled Snake's Revenge. A soulless cash grab that did away with the stealth action in favor for a more shoot-'em-up approach. Stripped of all the elements that made the original special, Snake's Revenge would nearly be a corporate chimera that would see an end to the franchise. Thankfully, this slight to Kojima's brainchild would not be taken lightly. Kojima would demand that Konami allow him to develop a sequel of his own on the MSX2. On July 20th, 1990, Kojima would release Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Now, MG2 wouldn't get a Western release at the time. The NES could barely handle porting over the original Metal Gear, let alone its sequel. Plus, Kojima at the time had no plans on making a sequel. It wouldn't be until December 22nd, 2005, with the special edition re-release of Metal Gear Solid 3 dubbed Subsistence, Metal Gear and its sequel would both be re-released on the bonus disc for MGS3 Subsistence, and that is the version that I will be playing for this review today. As I mentioned, there's only 2 canonical games in the Metal Gear franchise that I have yet to complete. One of them being Metal Gear Peace Walker, and the other being Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. I have tried to complete Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake exactly 3 times in my entire life. The first time would be when I bought Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence and had the bonus disc. The second time would be when Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain was coming out. I decided to play all the games leading up to it from first to last. And number 3 was about maybe a year or 2 ago. I had tried to play all the Metal Gear games from front to back in chronological order. Not chronological order, what would you call it? The order that they were released in. And all 3 times I ran into the exact same problem. I'd pop in Metal Gear, get towards the end of the game, be completely burnt out by the repetitive gameplay loop, as I mentioned in my previous review for that installment in the franchise. And then I would pop in Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake for, I don't know, like 5 minutes. And then my initial take would always be the same. Oh, this is exactly like the original, just a little more difficult. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to wait around. I'd get impatient and then directly move on to the cult classic, Metal Gear Solid. So this will be the first time in my entire life that I've played to completion Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. Mission briefing. By the 1990s, the Cold War had thawed, and it seemed nuclear proliferation would soon be a thing of the past. Despite this, all was not well in the world. A military junta came to power in Zanzibar land, a small nation bordering Pakistan, the former Soviet Union, China, and Afghanistan. After gaining its independence in the 1997 Mercenary War, Zanzibarland began attacking nuclear weapons disposal sites around the world, seizing those weapons that were still intact, and becoming one of the world's few nuclear powers. It then began to invade its neighbors at will. Meanwhile, a series of shocks to the oil market spurred the development of new high-tech energy sources, including fusion power. However, most vehicles still relied on oil for power. Oil reserves were at a critical low, and the world community was prepared to take drastic measures, either by drilling into sand and shale for more oil, despite the difficulty, or move on to renewable fuels. Such steps proved unnecessary when Czech scientist Dr. Kio Marv successfully bioengineered a new species of algae, oilix, that could produce petroleum-grade hydrocarbons with little expense and effort. In 1999, Marv was kidnapped by agents of Zanzibarland while on his way to the International Energy Crisis Summit in the United States. NATO discovered that Zanzibarland's leader planned to hold the whole world hostage by controlling the supply of oil, along with the threat of nuclear war. Ex-Foxhound operative Solid Snake was brought out of retirement by the unit's new commander, Roy Campbell, and sent into Zanzibarland to rescue Dr. Marv. On December 24, 1999, Snake penetrated the heavily fortified borders of Zanzibarland via a nighttime hey-ho jump, high altitude, high opening, from a C-130 Hercules aircraft using a radar stealth parachute. In order to aid Snake's insertion, a simultaneous diversion operation was conducted along the Chinese border. Making a successful jump and avoiding frostbite on the way down, Snake then advanced on foot from the dropout point to the base of the south-facing cliff wall. Free climbing his way to the top, being careful to evade enemy sensors, he eventually reached the infiltration point at the front of the enemy fortress. If Snake was captured during the mission, however, he wouldn't receive any assistance, negotiation, nor any rescue activity, as the mission was never covered under the conditions of the Warsaw Treaty. Act 1. First Instruction. Right off the bat, I feel like everything in this game had a significant upgrade from its predecessor. For starters, the music composition by the team at Konami. Listen to these tunes, they're hard AF. The storytelling, though very crude to today's standards, has a lot more depth. From the opening mission briefing that establishes a fairly detailed world for you to exist in, to the dialogue itself, all seems much more human. The art design and cutscenes, if you could even call them that, feel like we're getting a lot closer to the cinematic stylings we've come to know and love from the Metal Gear Solid franchise. I'm blown away that I never actually sat down and played this game. Is it good? Yes. Old school? Yes, but I feel like it has a lot more in common with Metal Gear Solid than it does with Metal Gear. Every gripe I had with the original Metal Gear has since been fixed or expanded upon for the sequel. Solid Snake commences Operation Intrude F-014 by infiltrating Zanzibarland. Snake will be taking direct orders from the new Foxhound commander, Colonel Roy Campbell, and will also receive radio support from a few supporting characters as well. Johan Jacobson, a zoologist and international authority on endangered species, the series debut of Kazuhira Miller, or McDonald Miller as he goes by in MG2, a former JSDF member, the Japan Self-Defense Forces and survival specialist, and Holly White, a CIA operative who's undercover in Zanzibarland posing as a journalist. Snake's mission is to rescue Dr. Marv from the Zanzibarland forces, who's been fitted with a radio transmitter implanted in his tooth. Snake is able to track the transmitter, but only at short ranges using his radar system. Snake crawls through a vent to gain access to the fortified base, the Zanzibar building. Making his way through the building, Snake eventually locates Dr. Marv on the 3rd floor. But it turns out that Dr. Marv's radio transponder had been found by the militia and used to lure Snake into a trap by a Special Forces soldier in disguise named Black Ninja. Armed with shurikens and reflex-enhancing armor, Black Ninja and Snake do battle. After his defeat, a dying Black Ninja reveals he was actually Kyle Schneider, one of the few surviving resistance fighters Snake had helped free during Operation Intrude N313 at Outer Heaven. Confused by how he survived and how he got entangled with the Zanzibarland terrorist militia, Snake interrogates Kyle. He details how after Snake's mission at Outer Heaven, NATO commenced a bombing run on the compound. a cover-up operation aimed to tie up any loose threads, murdering the likes of war orphans, refugees, and any remaining Outer Heaven forces, innocent or guilty. With no one left alive to speak about what happened at Outer Heaven, NATO would be able to control the narrative through the Western mainstream media. Those who were unfortunate enough to survive were captured and used in top-secret military experiments. Kyle was forced to partake in NASA's Black Ninja project, turning him into the soldier he is today. The facility he was being held at was attacked by a small number of surviving Outer Heaven soldiers. Snake questions himself. Could it be? Could he really still be alive? In his final breath, Kyle reveals how Snake can find the true location of Dr. Marv, as it would be what he would want. Follow the man in the green beret. The man in the green beret leads Snake through a jungle maze to an abandoned building where Dr. Marv was being held. By the time Snake made it to the building, Dr. Marv had already been moved. Snake could hear a tapping sound coming from the eastern wall of the building. With the help of Colonel Campbell, Snake's able to decipher that the tap code is a radio frequency, which he calls to reveal it's Dr. Madnar from Outer Heaven, the scientist who created Metal Gear TX-55. Madnar tells Snake to focus on finding his old colleague Dr. Marv, and not to worry about him. Marv is in poor health due to a heart condition, and fears he doesn't have much time left. Madnar also reveals two major revelations: that he was brought to the island to help build a new bipedal nuclear tank, Metal Gear D, a successor to the TX-55, and that the leader of the Zanzibar Land Forces is Snake's old mentor and commanding officer, whom he had defeated in battle and left for dead in Outer Heaven, Big Boss. With the updated mission parameters, Snake must now move north past the desert and infiltrate the tower building to rescue Dr. Marv to solve the world's looming energy crisis, destroy the new model of Metal Gear, dubbed Model D, to prevent all-out nuclear war with the West, and defeat his former mentor, Big Boss. Act 2. Reprieve of the Doctor. Moving north into the desert, Snake gets a mysterious encrypted radio call from his #1 fan, warning him about the minefield left in the desert. Snake encounters a Hind D helicopter patrolling the desert, and without the arsenal to destroy it, Holly suggests that he go past the nearby swamp, where there's a small armory Snake could equip himself with Stinger missiles. Sneaking into the armory, Snake encounters Running Man, a former star athlete during the 1992 Barcelona Olympics after he won the 100-meter dash in 9.69 seconds. Nice. He later would have his record in medals revoked after he tested positive for PEDs, performance-enhancing drugs. With his athletic career spoiled, Running Man would be politically radicalized by taking part in many activist and terrorist plots throughout Europe. Becoming proficient in booby traps and explosives, he'd meet Big Boss in France and be recruited as a mercenary for the Zanzibar Land Forces. By laying his own explosive traps, Snake was able to use Running Man's speed against him and take him out, retrieving the Stinger missiles. Making his way back through the desert, Snake eliminates the Hind D and proceeds to the tower building to carry out the rest of his mission. Amongst the many technical upgrades to Metal Gear 2, there are two gameplay mechanics that really stand out to me. The introduction of the ability to crawl, which you use to hide from enemies and infiltrate all these different military bases. And most importantly, the addition of the radar system, aka the minimap. Something I legitimately complained about in the first game. I mentioned that this game needed a minimap, and here we go, we get it in the sequel. I had no idea this thing would be introduced, but it is a welcomed addition to the gameplay. Not only do you get a sense of where you are spatially within the world, but it also completely changes your interactions with the enemies. Enemies no longer respawn as soon as you leave a screen. If you kill them, they are dead. But enemies can move from screen to screen as well, meaning not only do you need to be paying attention to what's immediately around you, but you now must also be keeping a close eye on this radar. Soldiers who patrol paths can now span multiple screens, which affects your playstyle in two ways. One, you need to constantly be checking to make sure an enemy is not sneaking up behind you to blow your cover, and two, you also need to try and guess which direction the enemy is looking in the screen next to you, so you don't walk directly into their line of sight. But if you do step into the enemy's line of vision, this now activates another long-running trope in the Metal Gear franchise, the alert system. If you're spotted, Now an alarm is sounded. Your minimap disappears and you must break the line of sight of any and all enemies and then hide. While hiding, enemies go into an evasion phase where they're not following their patrol routes and are actively seeking your whereabouts. Once enough time has passed, they will resume patrol and you get back your radar system. Within just an hour of gameplay, I could honestly say that the gameplay is actually fun compared to its predecessor. It's just so much more dynamic. There's so much more diversity in the mechanics that you're forced to interact with as the player. Now inside the tower building, a skyscraper at the northern end of the island, Snake is contacted by Holly. Her cover has been blown and she has been captured. Luckily, she manages to hide her radio, but she doesn't know where she is. Snake manages to triangulate her position thanks to some audio cues. Holly informs Snake that there's a carrier pigeon holding Dr. Marv's whereabouts on the roof. On his way to the roof, Snake runs into the next Zanzibar land mercenary, Red Blaster. Red is an elite assassin who earned his special operations degree from the Patrice Lumumba University of the former Soviet Union. He once served as a Spetsnaz explosive expert. His main fighting style involves laying traps using tripwires, and then throwing his RKG-3 anti-tank grenades at his target, while crawling behind cover like a spider. After Snake defeats Red Blaster by lobbing his grenades back at him, he captures the pigeon, and with the help of Miller, decodes the message and contacts Dr. Marv on his radio. Unfortunately, the Czech doctor does not speak English, so Snake will have to hunt down Gustava Hefner, an undercover Czechoslovakian intelligence officer who had been posing as Holly's bodyguard before her capture. Gustava has since been laying low, posing as a Zanzibar land soldier. Since there are no female soldiers in Zanzibar land, Snake's plan is to wait for her to go to the bathroom and follow her in. Okay, a few things here. I know this game is from the 90s, but this plan was shit. Number one, what if Snake finds her directly after she just took a massive dump and she no longer has to go to the bathroom? So Snake is just supposed to hang around outside the women's bathroom and just wait and hope that maybe she has to go again? What if there's a shift change and she's now off duty and elsewhere in the building? Two, if there's no female soldiers on the island, why would she be using the women's bathroom? Would this not blow her cover? And three, how dare Snake assume her gender and which bathroom she wants to use? Snake lurks outside the women's bathroom and follows Gustava in to accost her. Snake confronts the in-disguise Gustava, asking her for help, and quickly realizes that she's a former figure skater gold medalist at the Calgary Olympics. Gustava agrees to help Snake and takes the elevator located in the women's bathroom down to the sewer system. What the f***, Kojima? Out of all the craziness in the Metal Gear Solid franchise, and Metal Gear 1 and 2 are the most tame out of all of them, this has to be one of the wildest things that Kojima pulled off in the entire series. Why is there a freight elevator in the women's bathroom that goes down to an elaborate sewer system inside a military base? This is like Batman Arkham City style level design. Kojima, what were you thinking? Is this what happens inside women's bathrooms? You know that old joke that oh, women don't fart or poop because they have so much dignity or whatever. Is it because women go to underground silos to just let it rip unbeknownst to men? Is this what this whole gender bathroom debate is really about? It's just really courageous men cosplaying as women so they could map out the elaborate sewer systems that women use to take a shit. This is literally the plot of a goddamn South Park episode. Anyways, you hop on the elevator with Gustava and go underground. Gustava leads you to Dr. Madnar, who is now being held underground. You free him and then set off as a trio and try to find Dr. Marv and destroy Metal Gear D. Dr. Madnar in his old age needs to take a break and mysteriously vanishes off for a bit. At this time, Gustava and Snake take the chance to catch their breath and get to know each other. They discuss love and relationships. Gustava mentions that she was engaged once with a man named Frank Hunter. They were split up when they both tried to defect to America, with Gustava being rejected. Snake's life has been far more lonely than hers. His only friend and mentor defected from the United States and has now become his enemy. Campbell, Miller, Jacobson, people he knows but are all hundreds of miles away. Maybe after all this, he could speak with Holly. Gustava goes on to say that she has since joined the Czech intelligence agency and has since taken a life on the battlefield. And as Snake moves to console her, Madnar reappears and the trio leave the sewers. The group finally make their way to a detention camp where Dr. Marv is being held. They reach a suspension bridge, and just as Dr. Madnar crosses to the other side, A missile destroys the bridge and rips Gustava to shreds. Armed guards appear and haul off Dr. Madnar. And then appears Metal Gear D, being piloted by none other than Gray Fox. He warns Snake to leave the island as a professional courtesy. This will be his only warning, while Gustava dies in Snake's arms. Act 3. Under the Cloud of Darkness. One thing I glanced over so far is the improvements in the dialogue. Everything feels so much more fluid now. Like you're reading the transcripts of actual people, or I guess more accurately, like reading dialogue exchanges between two characters in a novel, compared to the dialogue in the original game that felt like this really one-dimensional tool that was used to just advance the plot or push the player in the right direction as to what to do next. The original Metal Gear is so much more matter-of-fact as the way they handle characters, and in Metal Gear 2, they actually feel like living, breathing people that get expanded upon. For example, after you rescue Holly when she's been found and captured by the Zanzibar Land forces, you have this dialogue exchange between the two of them where Snake comes off like a little flirty, playing into that aspect of him being lonely, which seems like it's solely there to build character. And when Gustava and Snake have the dialogue exchange in the sewers, they expand off that even further, where it really does show just kind of how alone Snake feels in the world. Or Gustava giving you her backstory to set up like an emotional impact for her death, which, spoilers, is a plot thread that gets further developed later on in the game. The mission briefing and returning characters with brand new unforeseen motivations like Gray Fox and Kyle Schneider establish an ever-changing world that exists outside the context of the game. For being released just 3 years after the original, I gotta say, MG2 feels like it was almost written by a completely different person. After a conversation with Holly, Snake learns that if he finds a hand glider, he can jump off a veranda on the 20th floor of the tower building to make it across the ravine that the bridge used to cover. Snake attempts to use the elevator, but is confronted by the Four Horsemen, a squad of 4 members of various special forces communities: the British SAS, the German GSG-9, and the US UDT, a World War II precursor to the Navy SEALs. Now working as a 4-member squad of assassins who specialize in CQC, close quarters combat. After a grueling battle in the confinements of the elevator, Snake manages to eliminate them thanks to his superior training from Big Boss. Snake glides across the ravine and infiltrates the prison camp, where he meets heavy resistance in the form of 2 more Zanzibar Land mercenaries. One, Jungle Evil, a former South African Special Forces Brigade operative who specializes in ambush technique and guerrilla warfare as the self-styled King of the Jungle. The skills he had picked up during the Vietnam War were not enough to outmaneuver Snake's elite reaction times. And 2, Night Fright, aka the Phantom Assassin, who also specialized in guerrilla warfare, but a different kind. His weapon of choice was a Chinese-made Type 67 silenced pistol, which he paired with a custom-designed optical camouflage suit that rendered him invisible. No one had ever lived to see his face in combat, except for Snake, who laid the legend of the Phantom Assassin to rest. Snake finally makes his way to Dr. Marv's holding cell, only to discover his corpse. Dr. Madnar, who is also being held in the same cell, explains that he succumbed to torture. Snake gets an emergency radio call from Holly, who informs Snake that she discovered evidence that Dr. Madnar was never being held hostage, but has been working with Big Boss the whole time. After the events of Outer Heaven, Dr. Madnar's radical scientific theories were rejected in the West. A reject and an outcast, the scientific community dismissed him as nothing more than a madman. This begun to brew a hatred within Dr. Madnar. Shamed, embarrassed, and looking for a way to get back at Western scientists, this is when he was contacted by Big Boss. Now working as a double agent for Zanzibar Land, he was feeding technological secrets to the rogue state. His mysterious disappearance when they were in the sewer tunnels bought him time to contact Gray Fox so they could ambush Snake and Gustava on the bridge. Sensing that his cover has been blown, Dr. Madnar reveals that he killed Dr. Marv in an attempt to steal the formula for Oilix. He also reveals that he was tasked with overseeing the production of Metal Gear D. With nothing left to lose, Madnar attacks Snake and tries to choke him out. Snake easily takes out Dr. Madnar, and then discovers that Dr. Marv was a huge gamer and had hidden a microfilm containing his Oilix research inside a video game cartridge for the MSX2. This introduces another long-running trope in the Metal Gear Solid franchise, Hideo Kojima inserting dialogue into the game that is fourth wall breaking and references you as a player playing a video game. Though a little less direct here, I mean, the shameless plug for the MSX2 is ridiculous. The MSX was developed by Konami, the developer and publishers of the Metal Gear Solid franchise. The MSX. That's the world's best-selling brand of computer, isn't it? You're one of a kind, Kojima. With Dr. Madnar's dying breath, he expresses regret for how he decided to live his life and tells Snake that the legs of Metal Gear D is where the armor is the thinnest. But this final act of kindness was also a final ploy to move Snake in closer into position to fall through a trap door to a room where he is now being confronted by Gray Fox and Metal Gear D. This might be minor spoilers for the Metal Gear games to come in this review series, but there is a lot of similarities that I didn't know Metal Gear 2 and specifically Metal Gear Solid, the original Metal Gear Solid, share. It's like a pretty long list of things. I mean, Snake coming out of retirement for a final mission, the game opening with a cliffside open environment before moving into a tank storage room with an elevator, Roy Campbell and Master Miller on radio support, having to work alongside the person that designed Metal Gear. Holly and Gustava of MG2 share a lot of narrative beats with Meryl in MGS. An anonymous person helping you out via radio, the stair climbing section, fighting the Hind D helicopter, the elevator scene, stealth camo. The way you defeat Running Man is very similar to Vulcan Raven, having to sneak through a vent to infiltrate the compound, among many other things that I can't name without major spoilers. And there's some things that this game also shares with other things in the franchise that I never made the connection between. There's connections in MGS3, there's connections in Ground Zero. There's so much in common. You could make the argument that Metal Gear Solid is a remake of Metal Gear 2, which is a theme that actually kind of follows throughout the Metal Gear Solid franchise, which again, I can't really dive into deeper at the moment without major spoilers. When I said Metal Gear 2 has much more in common with Metal Gear Solid than it does with Metal Gear, I didn't realize at the time of writing that I meant more than just like technically, but like narratively as well. Snake does battle with the bipedal tank, destroying it. The resulting explosion catches Snake's equipment on fire, leaving him without his arsenal. In the confusion, a surviving Gray Fox took this opportunity to steal the MSX cartridge containing the Oilix research. Snake chases down Gray Fox, leading to the two of them dueling to the death with CQC. With Snake coming out on top, a dying Gray Fox tells Snake about his past. Snake figures out that Frank Yeager, aka Gray Fox, and Frank Hunter, whom Gustava was engaged to, were the same person. Frank tells Snake why he joined Big Boss. As a soldier, you become a tool used by generals and bureaucrats for the will of the people. And when they have no more use for you, they cast you aside. Fox didn't need war, but without combat, he would be a tool with no purpose. Big Boss on several occasions had saved Yeager's life, physically and spiritually. Yeager would have followed Big Boss to the ends of the earth. His purpose, his raison d'etre. With Dr. Marv dead, the Oilix research recovered, Metal Gear D destroyed, Snake has only one more mission. Kill Big Boss. Now confronted by Big Boss, Snake declares that he had come to Zanzibar Land to get rid of the nightmares he has endured since Outer Heaven, with Big Boss replying that they would never go away. Big Boss explained that once someone has experienced the taste of battle, they could never leave it, and that everything he had done was to give Snake a place for it. He then tells Snake about his viewpoint on a logical system. Start a war, fan its flames, and create victims. Then save them, train them, and feed them back onto the battlefield. Big Boss continued on, stating that soldiers like them could never really lead normal lives, that it was an impossibility, that they only felt truly alive during battle, and nothing else would ever satisfy their cravings. Solid Snake then makes the decision to kill Big Boss, to set himself free from his grip, as well as to put aside his nightmares. Big Boss imparts one final speech to Snake before they commence their battle. It doesn't matter who wins, our fight will continue. The loser will be liberated from the battlefield, and the survivor will live out the rest of their days as a soldier. Snake and Big Boss engage in their final battle, but Snake is still without weapons. He scrambles about the battlefield, and manages to find a lighter and a lacquer spray can. Miller informs Snake that he could use the two as a makeshift flamethrower, lighting Big Boss on fire and watching him burn to death. While Snake is making his way to the exfiltration point, he runs into Holly, who gives Snake a pistol. The two shoot their way to the exfil zone, where a Sikorsky HH-64 Dragoon picks them up and returns them to the West. Metal Gear 2 is a game that I'm ashamed to admit I had rushed to judgment on and skipped over so many times. It's so much more than the original Metal Gear in so many ways. Metal Gear 2 is an underappreciated and underrated entry into the franchise, and most surprising to me about the whole thing was the depth of the dialogue. Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid franchise is known for deep philosophical themes tackling things like the military-industrial complex and the effects it has on nations in their quest to have their country's ideology be globally dominant. How countries treat their soldiers like tools and then discard them when they become a burden. How there's no true good and evil or good guys and bad guys in the world. It's all just a matter of perspective. Whether you agree or not, everyone has motivations and their own perspectives, regardless of how reprehensible you might deem their actions. Metal Gear 2 dives into many of these themes, and for a game released in 1990, this was unheard of for the time. And for that, I have to say that Metal Gear 2 was truly groundbreaking. If you're like me and never really gave Metal Gear 2 a chance, I'd recommend it for sure. Though, keep in mind it is still a product of its time. My one real complaint of the game is the radio system. There's a few choke points in the game where you're expected to call the right person on the radio in order to get a hint at how you're supposed to tackle your objective. But 100% of the time outside of those moments when you use the radio, even in situations where you'd expect to get some sort of information, like in a boss fight, you get the same handful of canned generic replies that don't add anything to the gameplay, which trains you to deem the radio as something that's completely useless, unless it forces you to actually use it. So when you enter a situation where you do need to use the radio, it kind of just never pops into your mind that that's a viable option. And that's my one complaint, that there just needed to be a little more incentive for you to interact with the radio to train you that it is actually useful in certain situations. Mission Debriefing. Back in the States, Snake hands over the MSX cartridge to Colonel Campbell, where they insert it to see if it works, and some more fourth wall breaking shameless plugs. Snake refuses Campbell's offer to join Foxhound permanently. The deaths and wars had taken their toll on Snake, who decides to go back into retirement, hiding out in the Alaskan wilderness, never to be heard from again.